In this lesson, we'll introduce some of the radical thinking of Charles Darwin. He was a naturalist who lived in the 1800s in England. And to appreciate Darwin's revolution, we'll need to learn a little bit about the prevailing ideas in his time, rooted in Christian thinking. So, of course, for the typical Christian in the 1800s in England, the explanation for the origin of humans was God. God made us at some point in the past. In fact, God made all of the creatures on planet Earth. And we're going to call this the special creation hypothesis, and we'll diagram it with this drawing here. So we've got three species of the millions of species on planet Earth. We've got the giraffe, the chimp, and the human. And in Christian thinking, then God designed and then created each species in a separate act of creation as told in the Bible. Now, of course, God was an intelligent being, and this is why we see species having different kinds of adaptations. We'll introduce a term here, the term essence. Each species had an essence, and we can think of this as the design plan that God used to make the first members of that species. And the essence of a species included the defining traits of a species. So, for example, the giraffe has the long neck, and the humans have the big brains, etc. So these would be unique species-specific adaptations. Well, it was God that designed species to have those adaptations. Now, importantly, the essence of a species was fixed. God's design plan, carried by all members of the species, was unchangeable. In addition, since the essence of a species could not change, then species could never change over time. The first members of each species could reproduce, but always making offspring of the same species. Giraffes were always giraffes. Chimps were always chimps. And humans were always humans, all the way back to the mind of God. And we can capture this relationship by saying the lines of ancestry are parallel. Notice, at no point in the past do any of these lines of ancestry converge. We'll use a metaphor then to say the Christians thought species were stone sculptures made by God and unchanging. And the stone sculpture analogy captures the fixed nature of species in the Christian worldview. The stone species are resistant to change by forces inside of nature. According to Christian thinkers, animals could not change themselves, nor could they change each other. God made them in a certain way, and they stayed that way since their creation. Now, Charles Darwin is going to disagree with this view. He's going to reject this view. After sailing around the world for 5 years, he's going to come to the view that species can, in fact, change. And they did, in fact, change. And he will propose a radical idea that species can change, and not only that, they can multiply. So new species can emerge. They come from nearby pre-existing species. And we can think of this as a process similar to what happens in human families, how parents have children, and then those children go on to have children. And so we get the grandchildren in a family tree, and all of the grandchildren, of course, are related by common ancestry, back to the original grandparents. Well, so too, says Darwin, species can have daughter species who can go on to have more daughter species, and all species then can be related by common ancestry, just like human families. Of course, all species on Earth today would have a common ancestor back to the origin of life. And so here we see the significance of Darwin's tree metaphor, the branching tree, the tree of life. The structure of the tree captures this idea that all currently existing species, the tips of the branches, can trace their ancestry back to a common ancestor, the origin of life. And this is a picture in one of Darwin's notebooks where he lays out this tree idea, and he writes, "I think." This is a radical departure from Christian thinking. This diagram is one of the few diagrams in Darwin's book, again showing the idea of a branching tree. Ancestral species splitting into multiple species, which can split again over time, thus multiplying species. So at this point then, you can pause the video here and read some of the key summary points on Darwin's view of species origin. But let's move on now to another element where Charles Darwin is going to radically disagree with earlier Christian thinking. First of all, on the left here, we see our familiar diagram with Christian worldview, the special creation hypothesis, that God is responsible for creating all of the species we see today, but those species have never changed since the moment of creation. But now let's focus on adaptations. So here we have a praying mantis over here, and all kinds of species have all kinds of different sorts of adaptations, and we're going to focus on the spikes on the forelimbs of the mantis. And adaptations, we can think of them as parts with purpose. And in the Christian worldview, Christians believed in what we're going to call the design argument, that God is responsible for designing and then making all of the adaptations of creatures all over the world, including the spikes of the praying mantis. So we're going to first examine the Christian sort of understanding of how adaptations came to be, and then we'll see how Darwin is going to modify that significantly. So first, the praying mantis has captured a bee here in these two pictures, and you can see the forelimbs over here, and these spikes help keep the prey secure. They have a purpose. Now, biologists call these features adaptations. Adaptations are heritable traits that help an individual survive and reproduce, and by heritable we mean DNA based. Now, these adaptations, of course, look like they were designed to serve a purpose. Now, Christians in Darwin's time recognized that the forelimb spikes, they definitely were adaptations, but for Christians, adaptations look like they were designed to serve a purpose because they were designed to serve a purpose. Right? It's God was responsible for designing these things to serve a purpose and then made mantises with these spikes. That's why they look like they have a purpose. They look like they were designed to serve a purpose because they were. So here we see a sculptor here chipping away at some stone here. So just as this sculptor had an idea in mind prior to making the first strike, so too God designed species adaptations to serve a purpose and then constructed species with those features. Thus, the purpose of an animal organ or appendage came first, followed by the construction of the part second. So the Christians have a certain sequence for how the mantis got its spikes. Step 1, God thinks of the purpose of the part and designs its structure to serve that purpose. So God is thinking, okay, I want the mantis to have some way to secure its prey. So its forelimbs have to have something that will help keep the prey from escaping. Aha, spikes will help secure the prey. So the purpose of the spikes is to secure the prey. That thought came first. That's the design part of the process. Then step 2, God makes mantises with those parts. So notice then the purpose comes first and the part comes second. Now over here we have that sequence laid out. This is the Christian worldview. That's the design argument, and Darwin is going to reject this. In fact, he's going to say the Christians had it exactly backwards. He's going to reverse the sequence. So for Darwin, we're trying to explain how did the mantis get its spikes. Now importantly, Darwin does not believe mantises always had spikes. So let's take a look at what that means. So for Darwin, what we see today among mantises, these are adaptations. The spikes certainly are adaptations. But in Darwin's view, the ancestors of mantises did not have the spikes, and that this feature emerged over time in the species. So to capture this, let's take a look at this forelimb down here. It doesn't have spikes. And here's Darwin's critical first step. Reproduction makes parts with different characteristics. Now, Darwin didn't understand about DNA, but he knew that when parents make offspring, there's often a lot of variation among the offspring. So imagine now, a lot of the mantises inherit the smooth forelimb from their parents, but there's some new variation in this generation, a forelimb that has spikes. Now here comes step 2. Parts that promote survival acquire a purpose. So in Darwin's thinking, imagine that mantises, some without spikes, some with spikes, are competing with each other. Well, what's going to happen? Well, the ones with the spikes are going to be able to hold their prey better than the ones without. And so the mantises with spikes will have a survival advantage. And so in this way, then, the spikes come to have a purpose because the mantises were using their forelimbs, using the spikes in a certain way, and it promoted survival. So the spikes get a purpose because they were used in the life of the animal and it helped them survive. So now we say the purpose of the spikes is to hold on to the prey. So notice then for Darwin, the parts come first. Reproduction is just generating lots of different parts with different characteristics. So the part came first, and then the purpose comes second as the animals puts whatever parts they have, tries to put them to use in competition with others. And the winners then are the ones whose parts are doing something useful. And we would say that's when the part has a purpose. So for Darwin, Darwin's going to reverse the order. It is parts come first, and then the parts acquire a function. So we can capture Darwin's insight here about reproduction with a metaphor that nature experiments through reproduction, which produces variation in organism construction. Again, Darwin didn't know about DNA, but he just knew that reproduction produces variations among offspring. But now, for the Christians, that concept of nature experimenting didn't make sense. It didn't match with what they saw out there in nature. So let's now start with individuals, mantises with spikes, because these are the individuals we see out there in nature and that the Christians saw. And they thought to themselves, but wait a second, all the mantises we see have the spikes. So the Christians posed a challenge to Darwin, because if nature is constantly experimenting, then mantises with spikes should be having offspring with no spikes. So you see the nature of the challenge here. If nature experiments, where are the individuals with no spikes? Well, Darwin had an answer. Nature does still occasionally make individuals with no spikes, but they are more likely to die. So we don't see them in large numbers. So this is the thing, that when we go out in nature and we see mantises and they all appear to have spikes, it's easy to overlook all the individuals born every generation with some mutations that give them a forelimb where the spikes are absent, or they're just not as effective as others in the population. And those individuals are going to be losing the struggle for existence. So they're going to be dying in larger numbers than the individuals that have the useful spikes. So that's what was missing for the Christian. And it's understandable, because this kind of thing is hard to see. We don't see all these creatures that perish early in their lives because they're not well suited to the environment. So let's pause here and we can read a couple of key summary points. So Darwin's ideas are radically different from the Christian worldview at the time. Darwin's going to reject the special creation hypothesis, and Darwin's also going to reject the Christian understanding of the origin of adaptations. So Christians thought that species were stone sculptures made by God and unchanging. Darwin's radical idea was that species were clay sculptures, potentially changeable over time. In the photos above, an intelligent mind is responsible for the design and creation of the animal. For Darwin, new species emerged from molding the clay forms of pre-existing species into new forms. Now, the idea that nature had the power to sculpt was evident in many geological formations around the world. Here we see some canyon walls carved out by a river, and various forms of erosion created these rock structures. The Delicate Arch in Utah, and Bryce Canyon as well, and Monument Valley, and again water sculpting Antelope Canyon in Arizona, and glaciers are sculpting valleys in Iceland. Darwin did not know about DNA or DNA mutations, but he didn't have to. He understood the variations in animal traits meant that the instructions to make animals and plants and everything else was somehow changeable. Now, Christians did notice that there were these variations in populations, but for the Christian thinker, the variations were not important. They were just imperfections of the essence. You know, the earthly realm is a bit messier than God's mind. But Darwin thought that the variations we find in nature was the fuel for species change. If some natural process interacted with that variation in a systematic way, species could be molded into new forms and multiplied over time. And we'll see that this systematic process Darwin will call natural selection. So now let's summarize the differences between Darwin and the Christians. On the left, we have the Christian worldview. Lines of ancestry are parallel, all the way back to the mind of God. So species were created separately at some time in the past, and they have never changed. For Darwin, ancestral species can give rise to new species. So the lines of ancestry converge in the past. There's something in nature that can mold an ancestral species into new species with different characteristics. With respect to the origin of adaptations, Darwin is going to reverse the Christian thinking. For Darwin, reproduction produces parts with different characteristics, and then some kind of competition in nature between individuals with variations leaves those with the best parts surviving and passing on those parts to future generations. So it's this competition that results in the part, in a sense, acquiring a purpose. So parts first, purpose second. And we'll just end with this diagram. This would be Darwin's view of those three species we saw earlier in the lesson. And yes, it means that we human beings share common ancestry with all of the other living things on planet Earth, all the way back to the origin of life.